I was a Millionaire's driver for 7 years, but the day I opened his garage, I froze in fear. For 7 years, my life was a measured routine of engine hums, polished leather seats, and silence that stretched longer than the miles I drove. Every morning, like clockwork, I arrived 15 minutes early, parked near the service entrance of Frederick Dalton's estate, and waited, always waiting, always watching the same iron gates, the same camera lenses tracking every move I made. Being a personal driver for a billionaire wasn't as glamorous as people like to imagine. It wasn't champagne and celebrity parties. It was discipline. It was knowing when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. And when you worked for Frederick Dalton, not speaking wasn't just preferred. It was survival. Dalton wasn't like other rich men. He didn't crave attention. He didn't appear in glossy magazines or throw lavish charity galas. The man didn't even have a publicist. In fact, I don't think I ever saw him smile, at least not genuinely. His whole existence revolved around control. Control over his properties, control over his business empire, and most of all, control over his privacy. From the very first day, he made one thing crystal clear. Never go near the garage, ever. Those words weren't delivered as a suggestion. They dropped from his mouth like a loaded threat, his voice low, deliberate, with just enough venom to make sure I'd never forget. And I didn't. God knows I didn't. The estate itself sat on a hill outside Seattle, surrounded by dense pines and enough security infrastructure to rival a military base. Electric fences, motion sensors, hidden cameras. I learned quickly that privacy wasn't just a preference for Dalton. It was an obsession. Every corner of the property felt like it was watching me back. But the garage, that place felt different. 8 heavy, steel-reinforced doors lined up like silent sentinels on the north side of the property. No decorative touches, no landscaping, just flat gray walls and a single keypad entry system with a biometric scanner below it. Only Dalton had clearance. Sometimes when I pulled the car around after a long day, I'd catch myself staring at those doors longer than I should, wondering, always wondering. My job, though, was straightforward. Drive Dalton where he wanted to go, keep my mouth shut, and never ask questions. I drove him to business meetings downtown, to quiet dinners in secluded private clubs, and, on occasion, to remote airstrips where private jets waited with engines already running. Most days were uneventful. I sat behind the wheel, eyes forward, mind drifting somewhere between traffic patterns and weather reports. Dalton rarely spoke during our drives. When he did, it was strictly business. Addresses, times, brief commands. There was no small talk, no personal anecdotes, no human connection, really. But then there were the nights. Every few months, usually when the weather turned bad or the city felt especially still, I'd get a text around 11 p.m. Prepare the car. 5 minutes. No details. No destination. Just that. I'd slip on my uniform, head to the garage-adjacent parking bay where the Maybach sat, and wait. Dalton would emerge dressed in dark clothes, leather gloves on no matter the temperature, carrying a small black duffel bag that never left his side. He'd slide into the back seat without a word, and off we'd go. South, sometimes east, sometimes just long winding routes through back roads that made no sense. Those nights, they felt different. There was an energy about him during those drives, a tension that thickened the air between us. He'd sit forward in his seat, eyes fixed on the side mirrors as if expecting headlights to appear behind us at any second. Once, out near Olympia, he told me to pull over on an abandoned service road. He stepped out, disappeared into the woods with the duffel bag, and didn't come back for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, there was dirt on his sleeves and something cold in his expression I couldn't place. I didn't ask. I just drove. But even with all the strange trips, the real mystery stayed behind those 8 steel doors. Over the years, I noticed things. A new security camera installed directly over the garage, its lens angled not outward, but downward, like it was guarding against someone on the inside trying to get out. Then there were the maintenance workers who came once a year, always after dark, always under strict supervision. I caught a glimpse once, a man in coveralls pushing a trolley of industrial cleaning supplies toward the far end of the garage. The door had opened just wide enough for me to see rows of covered vehicles, silhouettes beneath heavy tarps, shapes that seemed oddly still. On rainy days, a faint smell would drift from the drainage grates near the garage, metallic, chemical, familiar in the way that old blood and motor oil share a certain weight in the air. I told myself it was nothing. that it was just the smell of old cars, rust and rain. But I wasn't stupid. There were moments, fleeting but real, where I wondered if I should quit, find something else, a safer job with fewer shadows. But then the pay would hit my account. Generous, consistent, always on time. Tips that could cover a month's rent. And part of me told myself I was imagining things. That curiosity was dangerous, and some questions weren't meant to be answered. Still, it gnawed at me. Even in my sleep, the questions came. Dreams of the garage door slowly rising, of darkness spilling out, of screams that stopped too suddenly. I'd wake up covered in sweat, heart racing, staring at my bedroom door like it might burst open next. The worst part? I started noticing that I wasn't the only one keeping my distance. The other staff, Maria the housekeeper, Thomas the groundskeeper, even Luis from security, avoided that side of the property like it carried some kind of infection. Conversations would die the second anyone mentioned the word garage. Eye contact would break. Throats would clear awkwardly. It became this silent agreement among all of us. We don't go near it. We don't ask. We don't know. But knowledge has a weight of its own. And over time it felt like I was carrying bricks in my chest, each day heavier than the last. I kept telling myself, one day I'll leave. One day I'll get out of this. But I didn't. And deep down I think I knew there was going to be a day when that garage door opened for me, whether I wanted it to or not. There are rules in life that come with explanations, rules that make sense, that fit neatly into categories like safety or professionalism. And then there's the kind of rule that sits in your gut like a stone, unexplained, unquestioned, but heavy with something unspoken and dangerous. For me, that rule was the garage. Never go near the garage, ever. The first time Dalton said it, I was standing near the rear bumper of the Maybach, wiping down the chrome like my job depended on it, which in a way, it did. His voice came from behind me, low but sharp enough to snap the air in half. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, that garage is off limits, understand? I didn't turn around right away. Something in his tone made the hairs on my neck stand up. When I did finally face him, he was already walking back toward the house, his shoulders stiff, his hands clenched at his sides like he was holding back more words than he let out. I told myself it was just eccentric billionaire stuff. Rich people had boundaries, secrets, entire rooms dedicated to collections they didn't want the world to see. I'd heard stories from other drivers, tales of panic rooms, private armories, illegal art stashes, the kind of things money could buy when morals were optional. But over the years, that rule, it took on a different weight. There were moments, small, seemingly harmless moments, when I almost asked about it. I remember one spring afternoon, maybe my second year on the job, when Dalton's mood was unusually light. He'd just closed some massive property deal, and for once there was an air of satisfaction around him. We were driving back from downtown, the sun filtering through the trees that lined the estate's private road. As we pulled up near the main entrance, I glanced at the garage, then back at him in the rearview mirror. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking," I started, my voice casual like I was commenting on the weather. "What's in the garage? Some kind of private collection?" The change in him was instant. His gaze, which had been lazily drifting over an email on his phone, sharpened like a blade. He lowered the device, met my eyes in the mirror, and for a second, just stared. The air between us thickened. Without saying a word, he opened the car door and walked off toward the house, leaving me there with my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed felt louder than any shouted warning. After that, I stopped trying to bring it up directly. But the questions didn't stop. They just shifted, became internal, became something I carried quietly, like a secret I wasn't even supposed to have. It wasn't just Dalton, though. The entire staff treated the garage like it didn't exist. Maria, the housekeeper, would clean every square inch of the estate but never step foot past the gravel that lined the garage's perimeter. Thomas, the gardener, once cut back a few hedges that had started to lean too close to the far wall. I watched from my window as he worked, moving quickly, barely glancing toward the doors even though the sun was directly in his eyes. One afternoon I caught Luis from the security team standing near the edge of the courtyard, staring at the garage. His arms were crossed, his expression tight with something between concern and calculation. I thought about asking him then, but the moment passed. He walked away before I could open my mouth. It became this thing we all lived with. The rule that no one explained, the presence that no one acknowledged. Like a sleeping animal in the corner of the room, we all saw it, but no one dared poke it. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it embedded itself in my mind. Nights were the worst. When the house was quiet and the estate lights cast long, stretching shadows across the driveway, I'd sit by my bedroom window and watch the garage doors. Just watch. Nothing ever moved. Nothing ever changed. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something behind those doors was aware of me, waiting. The first real crack in my resolve happened during a storm in my 4th year. It was late, after midnight. The rain had started slow, then built into something violent. The kind of Pacific Northwest storm that shakes window panes and makes trees groan under their own weight. I was half asleep when I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Metal shifting. I sat up in bed holding my breath, trying to decide if I'd imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. A low, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the garage floor. I moved to the window, peering through the sheets of rain. The security lights flickered for a second, just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of one of the garage doors. It hadn't opened, but I could swear it had. Flexed, buckled outward for a split second, like something had pressed against it from the inside. I froze, hand halfway to my phone. Call someone? Who? The estate had its own private security monitoring system, and I knew damn well that Luis would already be watching the camera feeds. If there was a threat, I figured he'd handle it. But as I stood there, staring into the dark, a new thought settled in, one that made my skin crawl. What if they weren't watching the garage? What if, by design, no one was? I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind rattling the window frames felt amplified, like the whole estate was holding its breath. The next morning, the storm had passed. The garage doors looked the same as always. Perfect, unmoved, untouched. If I hadn't heard it with my own ears, I would have doubted myself. But I knew what I heard. In the days that followed, I caught myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking the rearview mirror even when I knew no one was following me, listening for sounds I shouldn't hear. The worst part was how normal everything seemed on the surface. Dalton remained his usual self, cold, efficient, distant. The house staff moved through their routines like clockwork. Life at the estate continued, just as it always had. But inside me, something had shifted. The rule wasn't just a rule anymore. It was a warning, and I had no idea how much danger I was really in. The sky that afternoon looked like it had been stitched together from bruises, deep purples, muddy grays, and that heavy yellow tint that only showed up before the worst kind of storm. The air smelled like wet asphalt and electricity. I stood on the front steps of the estate, hands in my jacket pockets, watching as the wind started to pick up, pushing the tall pines along the perimeter fence like they were blades of grass. Dalton was leaving for New York. Last-minute business trip, he said. Something about a high-stakes property acquisition that couldn't wait. Typical for him. What wasn't typical was how quickly he moved through the house that morning, barking instructions at the staff like time was sprinting past him. Maria kept her head down, jotting notes on her clipboard. Luis double-checked the security feeds. Even Thomas, the gardener, was called inside for a brief, hushed conversation I wasn't invited to hear. When Dalton finally turned to me, he didn't waste words. "You stay on the property. Don't leave for any reason. I'll call when I need you." His tone left no room for negotiation. I nodded like always, but there was something new in the way he looked at me, a tightness around his eyes, a flicker of something that almost resembled worry. No, not Dalton. The man didn't get worried, at least not in any way I'd ever seen. By 2 o'clock, the rain started falling in heavy, slanted sheets. The sky went darker than it had any right to at that hour. Tree branches began snapping under the weight of the wind, littering the driveway with jagged, wet debris. I pulled the Maybach under the covered awning just in case. Last thing I needed was a fallen limb smashing through the windshield. Inside the estate, the atmosphere thickened. The power flickered around 4 p.m. The lights in the kitchen dimmed, then flared back to life. I could hear Maria cursing softly in Spanish as she checked the breaker box near the laundry room. Luis walked past me with a portable radio, muttering something about checking the backup generator. I stayed by the front window, watching the storm swallow the landscape. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The pines blurred into a wall of moving gray. The sound of the rain against the windows became relentless, like hundreds of fists hammering at the glass. Then the lights went out completely. Total blackout. For a few seconds, the house fell into a kind of eerie stillness. No humming appliances, no overhead lighting, just the distant roar of the wind and the occasional crack of thunder splitting the sky. Emergency backup lighting kicked in a minute later. Dim, battery-powered bulbs glowed weakly along the hallways and staircases. I grabbed my phone, checked for service. Nothing. No signal. Not surprising given how isolated the estate was, but still unsettling. I found Maria in the kitchen, trying to light candles. Luis was already outside, making his way toward the generator shack near the east fence line, flashlight beam cutting through the storm like a small, nervous heartbeat. I decided to stay near the main hallway, keeping watch from the front windows. Something about the darkness outside felt off, the kind of wrong you can't explain, only feel in your bones. That's when I heard it. A long, metallic screech, coming from the direction of the garage. At first, I froze. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind, maybe a loose gutter or a falling tree branch scraped against the building. But even as I told myself that, I knew better. I'd worked on this property long enough to recognize every creak, every sway, every storm-induced groan. This was different. This sound had weight, movement, like steel grinding against steel. I stood there staring toward the far end of the courtyard where the garage sat hidden behind sheets of rain and swaying trees. My heart kicked harder in my chest, each beat sending a warning through my veins. For 7 years I had followed the rule. I hadn't so much as touched the keypad next to the garage doors. Hell, I rarely even walked near it unless absolutely necessary. But now something was happening. Another screech. Shorter this time, but unmistakably from the same place. I grabbed the flashlight from the supply closet near the front door. The batteries were still good. I clicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the gloom. For a moment, I hesitated by the threshold, hand resting against the frame of the door leading out into the storm. Every part of me screamed to stay put, to wait for Luis to come back, to let the house ride out the storm and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But something deeper, something stronger, pushed me forward. Curiosity? Fear? Survival instinct? I couldn't tell. Maybe all three. I stepped outside, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold slap of rain. The ground was slick beneath my boots, the wind pushing against me with enough force to make each step deliberate. The flashlight beam bounced wildly with each gust of wind. I angled it toward the garage. The doors were closed. But as I moved closer, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. One of the doors, the third one from the left, wasn't sealed shut like the others. It sat just barely ajar, maybe 3 inches at most, but wide enough to catch the light from my flashlight when it passed over the gap. I swallowed hard. The air near the garage felt colder somehow, even with the storm whipping around me. I approached slowly, each footstep louder in my head than the howling wind. Standing there, less than an arm's length from the door, I hesitated again. My flashlight trembled in my grip. Water dripped from the brim of my hood, trailing down my face like cold sweat. I leaned forward, trying to peer inside through the narrow opening. Total darkness. I couldn't see a thing beyond the first few inches of concrete floor. Another gust of wind rushed past me, and for a split second, the door creaked open a little wider, as if inviting me in, or warning me to stay out. I exhaled slowly, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and without giving myself time to reconsider, I slid my fingers into the gap and pulled the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The sound of the rain vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the thick, heavy air of the garage interior. I stepped forward, heart pounding, breath shallow. For the first time in 7 years, I had crossed the line, and whatever waited in the dark, I was about to find out. The air inside the garage hit me like a physical force, thick, cold, and laced with a smell that didn't belong. My flashlight's beam wavered as my hand shook, and I stood frozen just past the threshold, trying to process what my senses were feeding me. The first thing was the smell. Old motor oil, unmistakable and sharp, clung to the air like it had been marinating in the concrete walls for decades. But underneath that, woven into every breath I took, was something else. Something metallic, sour, rotten, the kind of smell you recognize on instinct alone. The kind of smell that makes your brain recoil before you even fully identify it. Blood and time. The smell of blood left too long in a place it was never supposed to be. I pulled my jacket sleeve over my mouth and nose, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The stench was already in my throat, making each swallow harder than the last. Forcing myself to move, I lifted the flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. Dust floated in the air like lazy snowflakes, illuminated in the flashlight's narrow glow. The first thing that emerged from the darkness were the cars, 4 of them, parked in a perfect line, spaced with military precision, each one a different make and model, but all vintage, all meticulously maintained on the outside. A deep burgundy Cadillac, a sleek silver Jaguar, a faded blue Pontiac, and at the far end, a black 1960s Lincoln Continental, long and wide like a funeral procession waiting to happen. Every car was coated in a thick layer of dust, years' worth. I could trace the paths where the mechanics had probably wiped across the hoods once or twice, but none of these cars had moved recently, not even an inch. I stepped closer, my boots crunching softly on the gravel-dusted floor. The flashlight beam moved to the Cadillac first. The paint underneath the dust still gleamed in places, catching the faint glow from the emergency lights flickering back at the house. But it was the inside of the car that made me stop cold. The seats. Dark stains bloomed across the front passenger seat and stretched toward the rear bench like spilled ink. I didn't need a forensic degree to know what it was. The dashboard had smears, too. Thick, dried, crusted over. A fine spray coated the back of the driver's headrest. My stomach twisted so hard I had to lean against the doorframe for balance. My flashlight trembled again as I forced myself to step past the Cadillac, moving to the Jaguar. Same story, more stains. This time spread across both the front and back seats, with a cracked window on the passenger side like someone's head had hit it. Or worse. The Pontiac was no different. Even with the grime and dust, the dark patches stood out too clearly to ignore. And then I reached the Lincoln. This one was worse. The driver's seat looked like someone had spilled a bucket of paint over it, except the color wasn't paint. It was darker, more textured. The floorboards beneath were stained too, with dried pools soaking into the carpet like permanent shadows. I stumbled back, heart slamming in my chest, the flashlight beam darting wildly as I struggled to breathe through the rising wave of nausea. That's when I noticed the shelving unit. It stood against the far wall, partially hidden behind an old tarp that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was warped with moisture, the shelves sagging under the weight of something. I don't know what pulled me toward it. Curiosity, horror, a need to make sense of the nightmare unfolding in front of me. My feet moved before my brain could stop them. The first thing I noticed were the license plates, dozens of them, different states, different colors, some old with rust eating at the edges. Some newer, still shiny like they'd been removed recently. Beneath the plates were rows of wallets, leather, nylon, even cheap plastic ones, stacked neatly like someone had been collecting them. I reached for one without thinking, flipping it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a Washington driver's license. The photo showed a young woman, probably in her 20s, smiling awkwardly like most people do for DMV cameras. I glanced at the name, the expiration date, but my eyes couldn't focus. My mind was screaming too loud. Next to the wallets, driver's licenses. A pile of them held together with rubber bands. Male, female, different ages, different ethnicities, all strangers, all people who were probably never seen again. I stepped back, knocking my shoulder against something hard. I turned and found myself staring at the wall above the shelving unit. Polaroids. Rows and rows of Polaroid photographs taped haphazardly to the drywall like some grotesque gallery. Each one faded around the edges, but clear enough to see faces. Faces I didn't recognize. Faces frozen in mid-scream. Eyes wide, mouths open, tears streaking down cheeks. Every single one of them photographed inside a car. Inside the cars I was standing next to. Inside the car I had driven for years. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I staggered back again, my shoulder clipping the edge of the shelving unit hard enough to send one of the wallets tumbling to the floor. I bent down, picking it up with shaking hands, and in doing so, caught sight of another photograph lying loose near the bottom shelf. This one wasn't like the others. No screaming face, just a shot of the back seat of the Maybach, empty, except for a single dark stain spread across the leather. My throat tightened. I dropped the wallet and backed away, tripping over a discarded oil can, sending it clattering across the floor. The sound broke something inside me. Whatever numb, frozen state I'd been in, shattered. I doubled over, gagging, the sour taste of bile rising in my throat. I pressed my fist to my mouth, trying to keep it down, but the wave of nausea came anyway, violent and unstoppable. I collapsed to my knees, retching onto the concrete floor, tears burning in my eyes. When it was over, I sat there breathing in shallow gasps, my whole body trembling. I wiped my mouth with the back of my sleeve, staring at the Polaroids, the bloodstains, the evidence piled in front of me. I'd spent 7 years driving for a man I barely knew, and now I was staring at the proof that I'd been driving for a monster. I don't remember making the decision to move deeper into the garage. My body seemed to act on its own, as if I was sleepwalking through a nightmare that refused to end. The flashlight beam quivered in my trembling hand, slicing through the dust-thick air, illuminating patches of cold concrete and rusty steel. Every step I took felt heavier, like gravity itself was tightening around me, daring me to stop, daring me to look away. But I didn't stop. In the far corner of the garage, half hidden behind stacked crates and old metal shelving, I spotted something that made my breath hitch. A tarp, thick, dark green, coated with layers of dust like it hadn't been touched in years. Its corners curled upward slightly, as if whatever lay beneath had shifted at some point. Disturbed, or perhaps added to. I hesitated, hovering over it for a few seconds, listening to the storm still raging outside, the wind pressing against the thin walls like a warning. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. My stomach twisted again, but I forced myself to kneel. With shaking fingers, I grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled. The smell hit me first, not as strong as the coppery reek that lingered near the cars, but bad enough to make me gag. Damp fabric, mold, old leather, and something else. Something sour and organic that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand on end. Beneath the tarp lay a collection of large plastic bags, heavy-duty, the kind used for industrial waste or yard debris. Some were sealed tight with zip ties. Others were loosely knotted, as if whoever packed them had been in a hurry or didn't care about containment. I reached for the nearest bag, prying the plastic open just enough to look inside. Clothes. Torn, stained, crumpled clothes. Shirts, jackets, jeans, some clearly from women, others from men. A child's hoodie lay near the top of one pile, faded yellow with a cartoon rocket ship across the chest. I felt my throat close as I reached for another bag. This one contained shoes, pairs and single soles, some caked with dried mud, others with dark stains I didn't dare examine too closely. Another bag held wallets and purses. I pulled one out at random, a black leather bifold with cracked corners. I opened it with trembling hands. A name. A face. The ID inside belonged to a man named Greg Whitmore. The photo showed him with a gap-toothed smile, wearing a baseball cap. Something about the name scratched at the back of my mind, like a memory just out of reach. I grabbed another wallet. This one was a woman's, blue leather with gold stitching. Her name was Rachel Myers. The picture on her driver's license showed a tired-looking woman in her 30s with hollow eyes and dark hair. Then another, and another. Every ID I pulled out belonged to someone different. Different towns, different ages, different faces. That's when it hit me. Greg Whitmore, Rachel Myers, a little boy named Aaron whose school ID was stuffed inside a Spider-Man wallet at the bottom of the pile. I'd heard their names before, not in person but on the news. Local reports, missing persons bulletins. Evening segments that played in the background while I ate dinner or washed dishes upstairs in my small apartment above the guest house. These weren't just random lost items. These were them, the missing. People who disappeared without a trace over the last few years, or longer. Names that had scrolled across television screens while anchors discussed search parties and tearful families pleading for answers. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, the flashlight beam falling from my grip and rolling across the concrete like it had a mind of its own. The realization settled over me like wet cement. These people had been here, in this garage, in these cars, in this house, and then, gone. An image exploded in my mind. Dalton, sitting stone-faced in the back seat of the Maybach during our late-night drives, giving me those cold, one-word directions. Drive south. Pull over here. Wait in the car. I had waited while he disappeared into the dark with that duffel bag he always carried. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the memories to stay buried, but they rose anyway. The nights I drove him to remote service roads, the empty stretches of forest, the hours spent idling with the engine running while Dalton was God knows where, doing God knows what. And then there were the stains I used to scrub from the back seats. Stains I told myself were from spilled coffee or road dust. But they weren't. God help me. They weren't. I pressed the heels of my hands against my forehead, rocking slightly as my stomach twisted tighter with every wave of guilt and dread crashing through me. Had I driven them? Had I been the last person they saw before Dalton? Before he... I couldn't even finish the thought. My breathing turned shallow. My vision blurred. I wanted to scream, to run, to crawl out of my own skin. But I stayed there, paralyzed on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by piles of clothing, wallets, and remnants of lives that had ended inside this garage. While I sat behind the wheel, oblivious, the part that broke me, the part that left me gasping like I was drowning, was the possibility that some of them had been sitting behind me, alive, breathing, watching the back of my head as I drove them toward whatever fate waited for them here. I thought about their faces, faces I had never seen, faces I had probably passed at gas stations or rest stops without realizing what was about to happen to them. My hands shook uncontrollably. I grabbed the flashlight, clutching it like a lifeline, and stumbled to my feet. I wanted out of the garage, out of the estate, out of this nightmare. But even as I staggered toward the door, my mind screamed one final question, one that sank its claws deep and refused to let go. How many times had I driven him? How many victims had sat in my car? How many had smiled politely when I opened the door for them, not knowing it would be the last ride of their lives? And worst of all, how many more were there? My fingers trembled so badly I almost dropped the phone before unlocking the screen. Sweat mixed with the grime on my hands, and my thumb slid uselessly over the surface until finally, I managed to pull up the dialer. The number burned into my brain, but it still felt foreign as I typed it in. 911. When the dispatcher's voice answered, calm and professional, I nearly broke down right then. "This is Derek Lawson," I gasped, my voice shaking so much it barely sounded like mine. "I'm at the Dalton estate outside Seattle. My employer, Frederick Dalton. There's evidence of multiple crimes. You need to send someone. Fast." I barely registered the dispatcher asking me to stay on the line. My eyes darted back to the shelves, the Polaroids, the stained car seats. My heart beat so hard it felt like it might split my ribs open from the inside. "I'm in the garage," I choked out, cutting off the dispatcher's next question. "Just hurry." I hung up before she could tell me to stay put. A part of me knew that was stupid, but another part, the bigger part, knew I needed both hands free. I needed to get out of here, get as far from this place as possible. But as I stumbled toward the door, something shifted in the air around me. A low click, metal on metal. I froze. The hairs on my arms stood up. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to hide, to run. Then I heard the unmistakable grind of the side door to the garage being opened. I turned, flashlight beam jittering across the far wall just as the figure stepped inside. Dalton. For a split second, neither of us moved. He stood in the doorway wearing the same tailored overcoat he always wore when traveling, his gloves still on. Suitcase dropped just outside on the driveway where he'd abandoned it. His face, God, his face, cold, blank, like I was no different from a broken piece of furniture he'd just found out of place. But his eyes burned with something I'd never seen before. Pure, calculated rage. And then I noticed what he was holding, a tire iron. I barely had time to react before he lunged. The first swing came fast, a horizontal arc aimed straight for my ribs. I jumped back instinctively, the metal missing me by inches and crashing into a stack of paint cans behind me, sending them clattering to the floor with a metallic screech. "Dalton, stop!" I shouted, hands raised, stepping backward toward the rear wall. "The police are on their way." I don't know why I thought that would stop him. If anything, it only made him more vicious. "You should have stayed out of this," he hissed, voice low and guttural like I'd never heard it before. 7 years. 7 damn years, Lawson. And you couldn't follow one rule. Another swing. This one grazed my shoulder, sending a hot spike of pain shooting down my arm. I stumbled sideways, crashing into a shelving unit. Wrenches and old car parts rained down around me. I grabbed the nearest object, a rusty crowbar, and raised it just in time to block his next blow. The impact jolted up my arm, nearly knocking the flashlight from my other hand. We circled each other like wild animals, breath coming in ragged bursts, the air thick with adrenaline and fear. I swung at him, more out of panic than skill, catching him across the forearm. He grunted but didn't drop the tire iron. Instead, he drove forward, shoulder first, ramming me back against the hood of the Pontiac. The wind left my lungs in a rush. Stars exploded in my vision. I lashed out blindly, elbowing him in the side, then swung the crowbar again, this time connecting with his knee. He collapsed to one side with a guttural yell, but even on the ground he was dangerous. His hand shot out, grabbing my ankle and yanking hard enough to send me sprawling onto the concrete. I scrambled backward, kicking at him with everything I had. One foot connected with his chest, giving me just enough space to crawl toward the workbench near the far wall. I grabbed the first tool I could find, a heavy torque wrench, and turned just as Dalton came at me again. This time I didn't hesitate. I swung with every ounce of strength left in my body. The metal cracked against the side of his head with a sickening thud. Dalton dropped. Just like that. He crumpled to the floor, the tire iron slipping from his fingers, rolling lazily across the concrete. For a few long seconds I just stood there, breathing hard, chest heaving, staring down at him, half expecting him to lurch back up like something out of a nightmare. But he didn't move. Blood pooled slowly beneath his head, dark and spreading. My legs gave out and I sank to my knees, the torque wrench still clutched in my hands like a shield I wasn't ready to put down. Somewhere outside, through the storm and the pounding of my own heart, I heard distant sirens. The police were coming. And suddenly, the garage felt even smaller, like the walls were closing in, like the air itself was pressing down, punishing me for every mile I'd ever driven for him, for every night I hadn't asked questions, for every time I looked the other way. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the driveway like a carnival from hell. I sat on the cold garage floor, my back pressed against the wall, my hands shaking uncontrollably in my lap. Blood smeared across my palms. His blood and mine mixed together in a way that felt wrong. Everything about this night felt wrong. I heard the crunch of gravel as the first set of boots rushed into the garage. Voices barked orders. Officers moving with urgency. Guns drawn, scanning every corner like they expected another attacker to leap out of the shadows. "Put your hands where we can see them, now." I lifted my hands without argument, my fingers still trembling too hard to fully extend. I felt the cold bite of metal as they cuffed me. More out of procedure than suspicion, I assumed. I didn't have the energy to protest. I barely had the energy to keep my eyes open. They pulled me to my feet. My legs almost gave out beneath me, but one of the younger officers caught my elbow just in time. His eyes widened when he saw the state I was in. Split lip, swollen cheek, blood soaking through my shirt at the shoulder where Dalton's tire iron had caught me. Then they turned their attention to him. Dalton lay exactly where he'd fallen, motionless, his temple caked in dried blood, his skin pale and waxy under the harsh beam of the police floodlights. Two paramedics pushed past me, kneeling beside him, checking for signs of life. I watched as one of them nodded grimly to the other. They secured his neck, loaded him onto a stretcher, and rushed him out toward the waiting ambulance. I half expected him to open his eyes on the way out, to lunge at me one last time. But he didn't. He stayed limp, unconscious, human. Somehow that made it worse. I stood there as more officers poured into the garage. Someone finally removed the cuffs from my wrists. A detective, older, gray-haired, eyes sharp with suspicion and exhaustion, approached me. "Derek Lawson?" I nodded. "We're gonna need to talk." And talk we did. For hours. They sat me down on the living room couch, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and started firing questions like bullets. What did I know? When did I know it? Had I ever seen Dalton with any of the missing persons whose IDs now lay spread across evidence tables like a macabre scrapbook? I answered as best I could, my voice breaking more times than I care to admit. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Polaroids, the stains on the seats, the pile of children's clothes under that tarp. Somewhere around dawn, they took me to the hospital for a full examination. A nurse stitched the cut on my forehead and checked me for a concussion. Another officer stayed with me the whole time, taking notes, recording every broken sentence I managed to spill out. The news broke before noon. By the time I was discharged, my phone, which had been left on the estate's foyer table, was already blowing up with missed calls and text messages. Friends, co-workers from past jobs, even reporters. I didn't answer a single one. The media turned the Dalton estate into a circus. Helicopters hovered overhead. Vans lined the private road outside the gates, antennas raised high, satellite dishes spinning like vultures looking for a fresh story. Cameramen filmed from the perimeter while journalists shouted questions at every officer who stepped outside the house. The phrase serial killer billionaire splashed across every screen I passed. Reporters dug into his past with a hunger I'd never seen before. Old classmates, former business partners, even distant family members gave interviews. Some expressed disbelief. Others said they weren't surprised. I sat in my hospital room watching it all unfold on the tiny television bolted to the wall, feeling like I was watching someone else's life unravel. Then, the real horror started to surface. The authorities expanded the investigation to Dalton's other properties: vacant lots in Oregon, a lake house in northern Idaho, a storage unit outside Spokane. At each site, they found more evidence, more bodies, some buried shallow, others deeper, some wrapped in plastic like the bags I'd found, others left to the elements. The numbers grew by the day, first a dozen, then 20. By the end of the week, they were reporting that at least 37 confirmed victims had been recovered. Dozens more were still unaccounted for, their names now pinned to corkboards in police stations and FBI field offices across multiple states. The victims weren't random, not entirely. Some were hitchhikers, picked up late at night on quiet roads. Others were business rivals who'd gone missing after contentious meetings. A few were former employees, groundskeepers, assistants, people like me, people who'd gotten too close to the wrong questions. That realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I kept playing back every conversation I'd ever had with Dalton, every moment in the car when he sat behind me, silent and cold, staring out the window. Every time I'd waited alone on those deserted roads, I thought about the nights I'd left the engine running oblivious. And then there was the one thought that wouldn't leave me. How close had I come to being one of them? Detectives told me more than once that I should consider myself lucky. A survivor. A hero even. That's what the newspapers called me. Courageous chauffeur stops serial killer employer. Some articles even tried to paint me as a symbol of justice. I became a trending name on social media for 48 hours. But none of it felt real. None of it felt right. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who'd spent 7 years driving a predator to his hunting grounds. I'd unlocked doors for him, carried his bags, waited patiently while he disappeared into the night. I told myself I hadn't known, but deep down I wondered if that was just another lie. I started having nightmares almost immediately. Always the same sequence. Me behind the wheel, headlights cutting through fog, Dalton's voice giving me some simple direction. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, it wasn't him sitting in the back seat. It was them. All of them. Their pale faces staring at me, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes hollow and accusing. I barely slept for weeks. Therapists the department recommended said it would take time. They handed me pamphlets with soft colors and smiling faces on the covers, told me about trauma response and survivor's guilt. I nodded in all the right places, but I never went back after the first session. The estate was sealed off, crime scene tape crisscrossing every entrance. I heard through one of the officers that the house would probably sit vacant for years, tied up in lawsuits and federal asset seizures. Dalton remained in a medically induced coma for days before finally regaining consciousness. The state wasted no time filing charges once he woke. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence. The list grew longer by the day. They said he wouldn't see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of his life. Good. I still couldn't bring myself to drive past the estate. Couldn't even take the highway exit that led toward that part of town. And yet, every night before sleep, one memory circled my mind like a vulture refusing to leave. The way Dalton had looked at me in that garage, like I was the one who had betrayed him, like I had broken some unspoken pact between us. 7 years of loyalty, 7 years of silence, and in the end, all it took was one broken rule. It's strange how quickly your life can divide itself into two parts, before and after. For me, the line was drawn the moment I pulled open that garage door. Months have passed since that night, but some mornings I still wake up expecting to see the estate through my bedroom window, expecting to hear the soft click of the front door as Dalton stepped outside, briefcase in hand, face as unreadable as ever. But when I open my eyes, I find the beige walls of my small apartment downtown, the sound of early city traffic below, and the faint smell of burnt coffee from my neighbor's kitchen drifting through the thin walls. I left driving behind completely. I sold my car, cleared out the few uniforms I'd stuffed in the back of my closet, and deleted the contacts of every private client I'd worked for over the years. I thought about moving out of state at first, but something in me needed to stay here, close to the place where everything fell apart, maybe as punishment, maybe because running felt too much like denial. Instead, I found something else, something that felt like it mattered. I joined a local victims advocacy group. They work with families of missing persons, people whose loved ones left home one afternoon and never came back. People like the parents of Aaron, the little boy whose Spider-Man wallet I found under that tarp. People like the brother of Rachel Myers and the friends of Greg Whitmore. The names stayed with me, as sharp now as they were the day I read them off those blood-stained IDs. Most days my work involves making phone calls, helping with paperwork, sitting with people in waiting rooms while they fill out reports. Sometimes I join the search teams that comb through forests and empty fields, hoping to find anything, an article of clothing, a set of tire tracks, any sign that someone had been there. I tell myself I'm helping, that I'm doing something good. But at night, when the city quiets down and my apartment feels too small, the weight of it all comes back. I keep replaying every year I spent behind that wheel, every silent mile, every dark road Dalton and I traveled together. I remember the times I waited in the car with the engine running, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, telling myself not to ask questions. I see their faces in my sleep, the people from the Polaroids. Their eyes find me, even in dreams. Even when I try not to look, people call me brave. They shake my hand at events, thank me for what I did. I smile when I'm supposed to. I nod at the right times. But inside, the guilt never leaves. It lingers like a bruise that never fully fades. The worst part is wondering how close I came to being just another name on Dalton's list. Had he planned for me eventually? Had he kept me alive because I was useful? Or because I was too stupid to notice? Some questions don't have answers. I'm learning to live with that. This afternoon I took a long walk through my neighborhood, something I do most days to clear my head. The air had that wet, heavy feel that always comes right before rain. The streets were quiet. Most people were still at work, and the neighborhood kids hadn't started riding their bikes up and down the block yet. As I turned the corner onto Maple Street, I passed a house I'd never really noticed before. One of those older brick homes with overgrown hedges and paint peeling off the window frames. Nothing special. But then I saw it. A garage door. Closed. Locked tight with a rusted padlock at the base and a sliding bolt along the side. Faded, chipped paint. No windows. No markings. I stopped in my tracks. For a long moment I couldn't move. My heart started to race and my throat went dry. The world around me seemed to slow. The colors draining from the sky. The sidewalk, the trees. My mind went straight back to the smell, the cold air, the Polaroids, the blood. I stood there, frozen, staring at that door like it might lurch open at any second and drag me back inside the nightmare I've been trying to outrun for months. A car passed behind me, tires crunching over loose gravel, jolting me back to the present. I forced myself to breathe, to take one shaky step forward, then another. I kept walking until the house disappeared behind me, swallowed up by trees and distance. But even as I moved on, the image stayed burned in my mind. Some doors should never be opened. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us which country you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Leave a like and subscribe to keep listening to real stories and secrets from the elite. Click on the story on your screen. It may reveal more than you imagine.